What's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here, Athletics, and today we're going to break down Ryan Helsley. This was a very commonly requested breakdown, and obviously one of the harder throwers to ever exist, up to 104 here. So again, one of the hardest throwers in the game, and one of the common, I would say, misconceptions is that a lot of the hardest throwers are purely there because they're 100% genetic freaks. And there's certainly a huge genetic component to that, but I also just want to highlight the fact that they're also doing something mechanically right. Simply based on the fact, and now having worked with quite a few guys who have thrown over 100 miles an hour at some point in their career, and a lot of times they do come to us when they're down 4, 5, 6, 10 miles an hour. It's not as simple as just having long levers, being strong, being a fast twitch athlete. That's certainly a huge piece of it. It's also having the mechanics, having everything synced up, and being extremely efficient with how you actually move on the mound in a game context. So, point being, we can reasonably infer that he has very efficient mechanics, at least for himself. So he's transferring energy very efficiently through his body, being one of the hardest throwers in the world. And again, this goes for just about any sport. Like if you find the absolute fastest sprinter in the world, like you look at Usain Bolt, right? Typically these are the guys who've maxed out almost every single variable, right? They have the genetics, they also have the sprint mechanics, they also have the training, they also have the recovery, they have almost everything dialed in. The Michael Phelps examples, it's going to be very hard to get to the very peak of the world in anything without having most of those different variables dialed in. So that's the first thing. He has very good frame, long levers, high strength, high power. He's a freak from one of his teammates that we work with. Has told us he's definitely a freak in the weight room. But again, that mechanical efficiency piece is going to be the big piece that we're going to look at. So he's really a great example of when we look at every piece of the kind of performance puzzle, the kind of create a player concept. And our job as coaches, in terms of how we set up routines, is like let's try to max out as many of those variables as possible. Some of them, like levers, you can't really do much about, height, etc., but a lot of them you can. So point being, I wouldn't say he has perfect mechanics, but he has highly efficient mechanics for his body type and for his body structure, and that is kind of an irrefutable fact. So when we go through some of the things he does well, but also some of the things that are quote-unquote flaws or not necessarily textbook, let's just keep in mind that he's found a way to elicit some of the highest velo ever recorded. So it can kind of redefine what exactly we think is a flaw if it's able to accomplish the task at the end of the day. So let's just go through the video now and kind of break it down step by step. So one of the first things we look at, if we look at the side view here, is what's their initial weight shift like? Do they have any sort of drift, or do they kind of stay stuck over the rubber? And we can see in his case, he has a pretty pronounced forward move. So the drift is one of those things where there is a sweet spot for every one individual. And the sweet spot is if you drift forward too aggressively, if this first move is way too aggressive, let's say he shifts way out here, then you're going to end up feeling that falling feeling. You're not going to be able to find your back leg again when you come out of the drift, and you're not going to ultimately be able to generate any power that way. So there is such a thing as too much drift. And then again, for a lot of the guys that don't have any drift at all, and instead of their center of mass moving forward 4, 5, 6 inches, as they lift their leg, they stay stacked over the rubber. They come to that balance point. A lot of times those guys then get stuck over the rubber and they have to push and extend off the back leg, and they have trouble rotating. So there's a sweet spot in there where there's just enough drift where you can get the train moving. It shifts everything away from the rubber, shifts the center of mass away from the rubber. And at this point now you can drop downwards. And because you've shifted away and now dropped downwards, it creates that lateral force vector. So he's shifted away, and now he can drop really aggressively into the backside. He's has one of the more aggressive kind of drift and drop patterns that I've seen. So forward weight shift, he's still relatively unloaded through the back leg, boom, drops straight down, and now he's creating this, very lateral force vector because of the initial drift followed by the drop. So he's not really presetting that hinge. He's floating through that forward move and then dropping into it. Now he finds the hinge right there. And that's when the back leg hits. That's when he finds that hinge position. Now you can just tell from kind of the angles he creates, and the angle of the knee, the angle of the femur, the angle of the tibia, that he likely is not a guy with a ton of hip internal rotation. So while hip IR is certainly beneficial in a lot of cases, there's plenty of examples of guys we've shown throughout the channel who don't have exceptional hip IR and they still find a way to throw hard. Justin Verlander, very low hip IR, still finds a way to throw 100 miles an hour, still finds a way to do it for 15, 20 years. And so again, he's in a little bit more of that vertical shin position. But one of the things that we've kind of discovered or kind of preached for a little while here is even the guys that don't have a ton of IR, what is the commonality? Is they're still trying to load tension and create tension through this entire back hip complex. So from the ground, through the foot, through the tibia, through the femur, winding as much tension as possible through this back leg when you actually find that hinge position. And that tension is what gives you something to then unload from into landing and create that rotation. So even though he's in more of this kind of vertical shin position, the question is he actively trying to hold that knee back? Or is he actively trying to create tension and turn the hips into this back knee? And I would argue likely the latter from what we've seen with every really hard throwing ER dominant guy that we've worked with. So even though he's not getting into that knee to knee position, this is likely an end range of motion for himself. He's likely in a good amount of tension at this point versus the knee trying to hold the knee back here and just kind of being loosey-goosey and not having any stability from the lower half. And then the other piece, if we kind of look at the direction his pelvis takes, so here, right? He's a great example of that ride the slide phenomenon where the pelvis really matches. He's got the drift and the drop and it matches the angle of the slope pretty much the entire way down. I would say that is probably the majority of hard throwers, but there's another category of guy that we also see that throws hard. So that is by no means a commonality amongst every single hard thrower, all-star pitcher, or anything like that. There's a good number of guys who their pattern is more pelvis straight out and then dropping down into landing. So like Aaron Sanchez would be one example. Clay Holmes is another example where he kind of strides up and out and then rotates down into landing versus just riding the slide and riding kind of straight down, mirroring the slope. So what you would likely see with kind of the force plate data is the guys that ride the slide and come into landing this way, it's going to be more of kind of this anterior to posterior force application on the lead leg. So you're going to get more of like this front to back blocking force. Whereas the guys who stride out and then come down into landing, land from above, those guys are likely going to see more of that vertical impulse, vertical ground reaction force off the lead leg. So point is there's not necessarily one right way, but he does this kind of ride the slide version of that. Now, the other piece that I would say, if you told me I could only pick one thing that was Helsley's key to why he throws 104 miles an hour, and obviously there's a million things, there's not one key. But if I could only pick one thing that he does really special and different to highlight, it would be his arm action. So he's what I would consider a long arm action god, and I like that distinction because there's so many coaches nowadays that are riding this short arm action fad, where it works for Giolito, it works for Pete Fairbanks, it works for Joe Kelly. I'm not saying it can't work for certain guys, but sometimes the pendulum can swing so far the other end of the spectrum where people start thinking that long arm actions are always bad, long arm actions can't work, short arm actions are always better. Everyone needs to buy X, Y, or Z piece of equipment to shorten their arm action, connection balls, fanny packs, whatever, what have you, to try to shorten their arm action. And he's just a great example of, hey, short arm action can work, medium arm action can work, long arm actions can work. It's not actually about the length, it's about how well does that arm spiral and arm action sync up with what your lower half is doing. How well do you capture the momentum of the downswing? How seamless of a loop of energy can you create from there into flip up, into into acceleration, layback, get everything in plane. So how seamless of a loop can you create with the entire arm spiral? So he's a great example. I mean, Jacob deGrom is another amazing example of just capturing this seamless figure eight of energy from handbrake. But he's letting that arm just freely relax and pendulum its way all the way up into this super deep flip up position. And you can see right here, I mean, this is like this is like more horizontal abduction than Ben Joyce. So it's a comparable position. So this is incredible amount of daylight, right? If we talk about the flipped up position, like at landing, where's the arm? And he's got easily over a foot of daylight between the head and between this almost fully vertical forearm. So incredible mobility through the front side of the shoulder, the chest. In theory, he's getting this range from the scap retracting and the T-spine rotating. He's not getting it from just like dumping into the front of the shoulder. You're not actually going to really know that without him throwing with a shirt off or actually being able to kind of get inside the shoulder joint in real time and see what's happening. But it looks to me like he's getting this range while keeping the shoulder in a relatively centrated position, so a healthy position. So really just highlights, despite him likely having a little bit tighter hips, really extreme thoracic range of motion, great mobility through the arm, through the front side of the shoulder, to be able to get into, I would say one of the more extreme positions that you'll see. So what is his secret sauce? It's this mobility through the upper half. I would imagine he's very, very strong through the upper half as well, like a Ben Joyce type, to be not only having this amount of range of motion, but to be able to throw hard out of that when you have that level of laxity requires both, again, the length side, but also the strength side. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if he has 80, 90th percentile plus strength and power numbers, especially through the accelerators of his upper half. In a bench press movement, in any sort of lat movement like a chin up or a row, I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the top guys on the team from that standpoint. So again, he's maxing out that strength side and the length side, if I were to guess. So from here, you can also see he's right around 90 degrees of elbow flexion. Again, it's not the most perfect angle, but you can see he's right around 90 degrees. And then as he actually goes into rotation, that elbow comes in a little bit. So now we're closer to that kind of 45-degree angle. Elbow tucks in a little bit, but he's still getting that really nice pull into ball release with the pec. So from just a couple of frames before, again, he's in this big scap-loaded position, maybe 20, 30 degrees of horizontal abduction, scap retraction, and he's able to close the gap from this point to ball release, where now that elbow is in line with the torso. So he's able to close that gap over 2-3 frames and get that big pull into ball release. And one way we can see that, as you might know if you've watched a number of these videos, is at peak layback. Where is the elbow in relation to the nose, the ear, the face? And it's the guys where the elbow is certainly behind the nose at peak layback, but generally even behind the ear. Those are the guys that are getting this big pull into ball release using the pec, the lat, the internal rotators, versus when that elbow starts to creep out in front of the nose. Now you're not able to actually get that pull, get that contraction from the larger muscles of your upper half. You're getting that contraction as a dart throwing motion from the tricep. So we all can kind of intuitively know and understand, like, your tricep isn't going to be able to generate as much velocity as these bigger muscles of the upper half, these huge internal rotators. And so guys will fall into that kind of rut if they do a number of different ways that the pushing can happen, but probably the main way is doing 2 and 4 pound, pivot pickoffs or heavy ball work, where the arm starts to get into this kind of protective mode and starts to shorten up and climb. So again, short arm action, not necessarily bad, but it's when the elbow starts to really climb and push forward out in front of the face at peak layback. That's when you're starting to get into the tricep. We might get some lower tricep soreness, some slamming on the back of the elbow. Your bicep is going to be more sore because it's doing more work to decelerate that action. But again, he's a great example of not doing that and getting this big, nice, long pendulum, fluid arm spiral, deep flip up, pulling into ball release with the pec, and fully taking advantage of all that upper body strength and power and length that he does have. Now let's look at some of the quote-unquote flaws that he has, because I think it's tempting to, if you looked at this delivery in isolation, you might say, okay, well, he moves athletically, he moves quick, but I don't like X, Y, Z. What if he changed those things? Would he throw even harder? Would he be even better? And I think it can be tempting to go down that rabbit hole, right? Like if I was a coach of the Cardinals, maybe it's tempting to say, well, imagine how good he could be if. But having seen a lot of those kind of experiments play out, and a lot of times when a guy is throwing as well as this, he's at the pinnacle of where he has been. you really want to be careful with messing with some of those fine-tuned variables that you think are flaws, because a lot of times they aren't actually flaws. It's just how their body moves and is one of the more efficient ways their body could move. And again, you kind of start tinkering at your own peril. So what are some of the things that maybe aren't textbook, but that I wouldn't personally touch and think may actually just be kind of unique to how he throws? One is how this back leg really shoots off into ball release. Right, this is supposed to be an absolute velo killer, where if this happens, there's no possible way to throw hard. The problem is there's a lot of pitchers that throw hard that do this. And I'm not saying that it's, something I will coach or actively look for, but it just goes to show, even if this were an inefficiency, like, it's not a major inefficiency in every case, because it's not like he would be throwing 110 miles an hour if you fix that, right? At most, if that is an inefficiency, maybe you argue a quarter mile an hour, a half mile an hour. You can't argue that this is a 10 mile an hour leak when there's guys throwing 104 that have this. Kyle Wright, one of our guys, another example. Walker Bueller's a guy whose back foot will come off about that high, but Helsley in particular, like, he'll get 6-8 inches off the ground with that back foot. So why is that really happening? Well, it's because he gets a little extendy with this back leg. And so when you get too extended with the back leg, even though it's not something that we would quote unquote teach, what happens is you actually run out of room in this back hip, and then when the hips do begin to finish their rotation, it pulls that back knee with it. So he's not necessarily a guy who's going to have the best hip shoulder separation you've ever seen, where he gets that foot fully turned over into landing. He's getting extendy, he's running out of room a little bit, and then as his hips continue their rotation, it pulls the back knee forward. So could you argue that's an inefficiency? Yes. Could you argue that's a major inefficiency with a guy throwing 104? No, I don't think you can. And that's not something I would personally change about his mechanics if I could. Glove arm, right? We traditionally hear that the glove arm has to be fully firm at ball release. And yet we see him as an example of a guy where his glove arm is down by that left knee. And so again, how much velocity is actually being lost if a guy throwing 104 has his glove arm down here? I would argue not very much at all. Could you argue that could be a command thing? Possibly. But again, something that I would not personally mess with, and just worth recognizing that there are a lot of pitchers that have success at the highest level that don't fit these textbook molds. And it really should make you question, is this something that we should be coaching to everybody? If you are a guy that coaches firm glove side to every single pitcher that you work with, or every coach you ever had tells you need a firm glove side, and then you see a guy like this throwing 104 without a firm glove, quote unquote, firm glove side, it should just kind of call into question whether or not those are absolutes as they're often portrayed to be. And then again, the length of the arm action. So the idea, which we already kind of talked about, that you need this short path to be able to throw strikes, you need this short path to be able to optimize velocity, command, get the arm in plane. Again, it's very possible to get the arm in plane with a longer spiral. There are cases, for example, we work with, do some work with Pete Fairbanks, and if you've ever seen before video of Pete Fairbanks with a longer arm action, he was way off time, way out of plane, and for him, shortening up was one strategy for him to get the arm back in plane, and it got him back in plane, and that's when he started throwing 100. But had he been able to get the arm on time and back in plane while keeping a longer swing, just like Helsley, he also would have started throwing harder as well. So there's multiple ways to skin a cat. Short arm action isn't necessarily bad, but again, it goes to show you how many coaches would see this guy in the minor leagues and think immediately, I need to change this guy's arm swing, I need to change this guy's back leg, I need to change this guy's glove arm, and now all of a sudden, he's not Ryan Helsley anymore. He's a yipped up 94, 96 version shadow of himself, of what he really could have been. And how many guys are in the minor leagues right now throwing 3 to 5, 4 to 6, 5 to 7, that really could be throwing 100 plus miles an hour, if they were kind of left alone and allowed to throw how their bodies naturally wanted to throw. And that's just kind of an open-ended question for you guys to think about. So, and then the final thing too is, how many of you have heard, you need to land in a good fielding position, right? One of the more common, maybe not as much anymore, but he is rotating violently around a firm lead leg. After ball release, he falls off. But that's one of the more common follow-throughs for the hardest throwers, is they're rotating violently. And so if you want to have this perfectly balanced Greg Maddux delivery and throw 91, that's one option. But if you were to coach Ryan Helsley to finish in a good fielding position, he's going to throw 97, and he's not Ryan Helsley anymore. So again, how many coaches would cue that, finish in a good fielding position cue? It just goes to show like the intent behind what he's trying to do is going to shape the ultimate and end movement solution. He's trying to throw the absolute piss out of the ball. He's trying to throw it through the catcher's face mask, through the glove, and by the hitter. He's not trying to finish in this perfect still head, firm glove side, good fielding position, careful delivery, like a lot of coaches would teach. And then just to get back to one of the points I made earlier in the video, there's just a lot of examples of 100-mile-an-hour guys who, for whatever reason, lost it, right? You think and you assume that these guys are just freaks, that they throw 100, they're just different than me. Like that's, again, there is some of that. I'm not saying that there isn't a genetic component, but you think that like they're only there because of their genetics. And there's just so many examples time and time again of guys that threw 100 and now 5 years later they're screwed up, they had an injury, they have compensation, and now they throw 92. And it makes you really realize how important the mechanical efficiency piece of it is. It's an extremely important piece, and we should just be careful with messing with guys once they get to what is efficient for them. So that's, again, really what I had on Helsley. I like his lower half. I like his drift. I like the athletic drop, the tempo. His lead leg works great. And more than anything, I think the deep arm spiral is his key, kind of similar to like a Ben Joyce example, where, again, big physical dude, really good arm, gets in deep positions, captures that spiral well, and does enough right with his lower half where that's not a hindrance. But it's really the exceptional elite arm action that I think is what gives him that extra few ticks that gets him into like this elite stratosphere of closer. So hopefully you guys got something out of that video. Hopefully you learned something. Let me know down in the comments what you want to see me talk about next, who you want me to break down next, and I will do my best to make that happen. Thanks again, guys.